Hello and welcome to another episode of For the Love of Sports. My name is Michael Rasile, and this is the show where I get to talk about sports, I get to talk about business, and I get to talk about everything in between. Today, my incredible guest, Leonard Jones. He's the author of At the Bat, the Strikeout That Shamed America. It is based off the very well-known poem Casey at the Bat, and he was also a USA Today reporter for almost 20 years. Del, how you doing today?
I'm doing good, Michael. How are you?
It's a good day to be alive, Del. It's a good day to be alive. Every one of them is. Everyone that ends in Y. I love them. They're all great. So very excited to get to talk about your book, talk a little bit about your sports writing career, obviously working at USA Today, a very well-known publication, especially, I'm always curious, especially with someone that was there for 20 years. I got some fun questions for you. But first question I have for everybody on the For the Love of Sports podcast is, why do you love sports so much?
Oh, wow. That's probably for a lot different reasons than most of your guests. I'm not, most of your guests are good athletes, good coaches, those kind of people, good business people. I actually grew up in a family that was more into backpacking, hunting, fishing, that kind of thing.
Those are sports.
Yeah, they're sports, but not organized sports. And I was did very little, like little league baseball and that kind of thing. And it's probably a good thing because I'm small. And I would have grown up, and even if I was a decent athlete, I wouldn't have gone very far. And but I did the whole time. I loved reading and watching sports on TV, and especially reading sports in like Sports Illustrated and the newspapers, because sports writing is the best actual bare writing there is in journalism. I mean, there's better reporters probably in other fields of journalism, but the best writers that I've ever found in journalism were sports writers. So I learned a lot about writing just by reading sports writers. And then my love of sports has evolved over time. When I had children, I thought I had missed out on sports so much that as soon as they turned 5 years old, they were in t-ball, they were in soccer, they were in everything. And I was always like volunteering to be the assistant coach, because I didn't want to be the head coach because I couldn't deal with angry parents. So if you're the assistant coach, you can, when the angry parents come up, you can just say, "Oh, go talk to the head coach."
Very smart.
Yeah. I thought it was. So I got to enjoy the whole game without the added pressure of it. And so I really enjoyed sports at that level. In fact, I started tuning out more and more of like the upper level televised professional sports. I'm still a fan of those, but I became more and more of a fan of low-level sports. In fact, you can the home run that's hit on TV, you can take it. Give me some like 9-year-old shortstop that makes a diving catch. To me, that's a thrill of sports, and so I really gravitated toward that. And then my last evolvement was after my kids grew up and evolved out of sports. I went into sports officiating, which I really love. I mean, people think I'm just crazy and nuts to love sports from that standpoint, but I really like doing sports officiating.
I love it. I'm not going to lie. I can hear, is that a home telephone?
Yeah, that's a home
Those
telephone.
still exist? That's incredible. No, I kid.
Yeah, well, I still have a landline. I don't answer it, which you can tell.
Yeah. Does anybody? I don't even know.
It doesn't ring right. Yeah, it's where I put, whenever I have to fill out my phone number
there you go.
For somebody to call, I give them my landline that, when it gets transferred around to everybody, and I know it's just a junk call. People I really want to call my
exactly. They have your number. They're not looking to talk to you or your wife. They're looking to just talk to one of you. So no, but it's I think it's really impressive. So I guess kind of that first point that you made, I'm really curious about that. What is it about sports writing and sports writers? Is it the phone's ringing again? Maybe this is important.
You want me to go turn it off?
Yeah, if you don't mind. If you don't mind. That's why we do it live, people. That's why we do this live.
Sorry about that. Hopefully you can edit that out, unless you want some excitement.
No, we're live, so nothing you can edit live.
Okay.
So, but no. So with what is it about sport writers and sports writing that you that you believe is the the highest form, I guess, you know, outside of novella writing and that kind of stuff. What is it about that type of writing that really that you gravitated towards?
There's just more freedom to it. The creativity. I mean, you're there covering a game. You're not, you know, and the basic rule in journalism: if you have a good story, you report it. If you don't have a good story, you write it. I mean, if you ever see like good, like really flamboyant writing in like a story about the Supreme Court or something, it means you don't have a very good story because you have to write it instead of tell it. People just want the facts in regular journalism. But sports is a different animal, especially with TV. Everybody knows the outcome of the game. Everybody has seen it, but reading about it, it's more artistic the way they write about it.
Interesting. Yeah. And you know, you bring up Sports Illustrated when they were still like a real company that people cared about. Like they did some incredible stuff back in the day, of course. And that's what got most people today that are writing, you know, some of the gentlemen, you know, 10 years older than I, those guys got into sports writing because of that. And it sounds like you were gravitated towards that as well. And you had a little bit of time, again, as we said, at USA Today for, you know, almost 20 years. You worked on the business side as well as you worked on the sports reporting side. So how was it? I mean, you started in 1992, or at least that's what your LinkedIn profile says. So you started before email, and by the end, you got pretty popular on Twitter. So you literally spanned technology in about 18 years, 20 years, whatever it is. What was that like, and needing to essentially reinvent yourself over and over and over again, because you know that if you stay stagnant, that's how you fail.
Boy, that is sure true. I actually started out as a sports writer. When I graduated college, I went to a couple of small town newspapers and was a sports writer. But it was kind of my dream to get to a major publication. And like, you know, they always say that the fastest way to the major leagues in baseball is to be a catcher. The fastest way to a major publication in journalism is to be a business writer. And you know, I didn't really mind because I had an interest in business. I got my MBA. And so I had a real interest in business, but it was the fastest way to a major publication. And you're right. I don't know. I've been watching this TV. I've been watching this TV show called *Halt and Catch Fire*, kind of binging it. And it's about kind of the dawn of technology. I think it starts in like the mid '80s when, you know, I saw one thing, I thought Google was a dang miracle, because before Google came along at USA Today, you could search, you know, keywords for everything that had ever been written in USA Today, you know, which is kind of a tiny universe compared to what Google looks at now. So you had this tiny universe of everything that had been written in USA Today. You'd pop in a couple of keywords trying to find a story that had been written about something that you're writing about. And that thing would crank and crank and crank and churn. And, you know, maybe 30 seconds later, up would pop like, you know, 4 or 5 stories that would have your keywords in it. And so when Google came along, I just thought it was a damn miracle that in like an eighth of a second, it was searching zillion. You know, I still don't understand how Google can do it when it was just, you know, cranking away for a minuscule amount. And yeah, I remember when the internet came out, there was one terminal I worked in the money section, and in the money section, there was one computer where you could go and look on the internet if you wanted to go search the internet, if you were even advanced enough to even know how to go search the internet for something. And everybody else just had the big box computers. And you know, that evolved. In fact, USA Today in 2000 moved into a brand new building that was like 3 times bigger, had 3 times more seats than they needed, more desks than they needed for USA Today, because in 2000 all these .com companies were advertising like crazy, and USA Today was just making money hand over fist with all the .com advertising. And so they built this brand new headquarters, a big building, without even knowing that it was these same .com companies that were going to basically destroy the business model. And so in fact, I wrote a story one time in the business section, even before this, about how whenever a company builds a brand new headquarters, that's the time to sell the stock. Because if you look at it, every time they think they're like growing by leaps and bounds, you know, you zig when they say zag, and you can kind of recognize that. So then I kind of saw the end of the business model of newspapers. I mean, there's still eyeballs for news, but the business model where the advertising, it used to be they would sell an advertising in the print edition of USA Today for, $1 million. Now the advertising's moved to the internet where, it's a couple of cents a click or something, and they're just making a fraction of the money on advertising that they once were. Plus they don't have the subscription money, most of them. And so, I feel I love the technology, but it's basically, I think it's hurt journalism, because I don't think people realize that when they subscribe, when they read a story that's in the Washington Post or the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, the staff that those companies are using now are a fraction of the staff they once had. And it's basically, grind out, the days of when I was in journalism, these major papers sometimes would put 3 reporters full time on a story for 6 months or something, some in-depth reporting job. And that, they just don't have the money to do that anymore.
Yeah. And that type of reporting barely exists anymore, outside of, a few major publications, which is, some people say, not a good thing, which, in terms of what happens, we don't need to go down that path too much, but I definitely do think that, it is unfortunate, because now, I mean, there's positives and negatives to everything, right? Like anyone can go on the internet and you could start a company and start writing and start reporting yourself, but that might not be completely factual, as we've found out over the last few years. So it's something that is disappointing, but at least it allowed you to hone your skills writing wise and continue to get better at them to then become a published author. So I do want to talk. So you have 2 books. We're going to be talking about the one at the Bat, The Strikeout That Shamed America. Again, it's based on the Casey at the Bat poem. And spoiler alert for anyone out there, the poem was written like the 1800s. So I apologize if I'm ruining it for you, but Casey, the mighty Casey, strikes out at the end. So I'm curious, what is it about this story? What is it about baseball? Where did the idea for you to say, hey, I want to write this book and dive deeper into what the poem's like 20 lines, maybe, from what I remember? Like, it's not like this in-depth Robert Frost kind of like Shel Silverstein go on and on and on forever kind of thing. It's pretty short. Strike 1, strike 2, strike 3, and then the crowd's like, oh my gosh. And like, that's the story. I apologize again, but what was it about this, and where did the creativity come from on your end to say, there's a universe here, I kind of want to expand upon it?
Yeah. The poem's 13 stanzas, and it is short. And the reason I did it, I've always considered myself a pretty good writer, but when I decided I wanted to write a novel, I had trouble coming up with an idea of a story that would sustain an entire novel. And my father, who's 96 now, he's still alive, and people of his generation actually memorized a lot of poetry. If you go back, for some reason in the schools back in those days, they would memorize a lot of poetry. And so my dad could recite The Cremation of Sam McGee and a bunch of other poems by memory. And I tried, and I could only get about halfway through it. And so I decided, when I couldn't come up with an idea for a novel, I said, well, God, here's the story right here in a poem. And I can just, I've got the basis kind of writing a novel, and I could just expand on it. And so with Casey at the Bat, the story was right there. And it's a beautiful story, because the tension just builds. As short as it is, it's basically, everybody in the stands knows that if Casey can get up to bat, he's going to win the game. But the trouble is that there's 2 outs in the bottom of the 9th, and here's a couple of weak hitters in front of him that just don't have a chance of getting on base. And so everybody just assumes that, they're the problem of the poem. And by some miracle, they both get on base ahead of Casey. And then Casey strikes out. Everybody now expects, the hard part's over. And Casey gets up and he strikes out. And it's this twist at the end that has made the poem famous, I believe. I think if he'd hit the walk-off home run, you'd never know about it. And it was actually first printed in 1888 in the San Francisco Examiner. And back then they didn't have wire services. So they would write these things like poetry and recipes and stuff, that if there was a white hole at the bottom of some page that they didn't have anything to put in there, they would just slap this thing in. And that's what Casey at the Bat was. It was at the bottom of page 4 of like a 12-page newspaper. And you could tell it was so hurriedly written that there's a guy named Jimmy Blake in the poem, one of these weak hitters. And he's Jimmy Blake in one stanza and Johnny Blake in the next stanza. And that's all been changed. If you look up Casey at the Bat in any book or the internet now, that has been fixed. But I went back and I actually found the original poem on the page, and you could tell it was written in such a hurry that they didn't even edit the names right to get those right. And it was signed by Finn. The poem was written by Ernest Thayer, who didn't even admit that he wrote the poem until a few years later. He signed it Finn. He was just so embarrassed that, he was like forced to write this poem. And so that's why I decided to take this poem. Plus it's at the dawn. It's said the poem was written basically at the dawn of professional baseball. The Cincinnati Red Stockings were the first, I think, in 1871, but it wasn't really catching on professional baseball until around then. And the game itself really changed. Before professional baseball, it was just a bunch of college guys kind of just, being polite and playing a polite game. When it turned professional, there were all these Irish immigrants looking for a job. And to keep a job in baseball that would pay you, you had to be like cutthroat. And so the game changed from being this collegial pastime to just a real cutthroat, dirty game. And the umpires took the brunt of it. We can get into what the umpires went through in those days too, but they went through a lot more than they do today.
Well, they deserve, some of them, talking to you, Angel Hernandez, some of them deserve it. Some of them absolutely deserve it. But it is what it is. And I think it's just interesting that you were able to not only just do the research and find all these interesting little facts about the poem itself and the story and everything, but being able to take that idea of just a quick, as you said, 13-line poem, and some stuff happened and he strikes out at the end, and it's a twist. And I remember it, as I was telling you before, it was a twist to a 5-year-old Mike, right? Like, I had no idea. I just assumed Casey was going to hit the home run, as we all do when we're 5 years old. So it's just interesting how you were able to take that short poem and kind of expand upon it to learn more. So tell me more about the book itself and how, like, what is the universe we're living in? Is this is before, this is after, this is during the time of that strikeout in fictional time? And then how did you use like real world examples, as you said, with these Irish immigrants and taking the umpires getting a literal beating for some of this stuff? How were you able to kind of mix in that fiction and nonfiction aspect to, again, just create this world to get people interested?
Okay. I first started out, I decided to narrate probably the second most important person in the poem is the umpire. I mean, everybody knows the line, kill the umpire, kill the umpire. They're all yelling because Casey doesn't swing at the first 2 pitches. They're called strikes. And, everybody wants Casey to win the game. And here's this umpire calling 2 strikes on Casey. And so because of my sports officiating background, I never umpired at a high level, but I know what it's like to be basically despised by people all around you. And so I thought I could kind of like narrate the book from the umpire's point of view. And so I did some research on umpiring, and they were back then, almost every umpire was a former player who had just recently retired from the game. And I think there's a list of them on Wikipedia where you can look at every major league umpire. And if you go back into the late 19th century, the umpires lasted 1 year and then they were gone. And it was because, I think it was because these players thought, oh, I know the game, I know the rules, easy money, I'll go umpire. And they found out pretty quickly that umpiring wasn't as much fun as they thought it would be. So that was one aspect. Plus, they were beaten fairly regularly.
Literally.
Literally beaten, because in those days, they gave umpires the ability to fine managers and players, but not to eject them. And because the team owners thought these like fights and rhubarbs, these hockey-like situations were good for the gate, they paid the fine. So if a player went up and like socked an umpire and the umpire like gave him a $50, he couldn't even eject him. All I could do is like fine him $50 or something, which is probably a fortune to the player on his salary. But then if the owner would pay it, what's to stop the player from like smacking him the next time? And so there was a lot of routine battery, and it started to phase out, eventually phased out when the owners started noticing a lot of women in the stands. Not a lot, but like 10% of the crowd was women, and they decided, well, we need to, if we're going to like really expand on this part of our business, we're going to have to tame the game down a little bit. And so that's when they gave the umpires the ability to eject. And getting to your question about the time period, I actually used real life characters in the book, because when I started researching baseball at the time the poem was written, one player was Cap Anson. He was like one of the early Hall of Famers, and he's largely, I don't know if he's blamed or credited or whatever, but he basically had a lot to do with banning African Americans from baseball. He was a racist player, and there was one game where he basically had his team walk off the field rather than play a team that had an African American player on it. And so I saw him, and then I saw that the last African American to play Major League Baseball before Jackie Robinson was in 1884, and that was Moses Fleetwood Walker, and he played one season, and he was not known as a great hitter, but a very great defensive catcher. And I thought, well, how perfect is this? I need a catcher. The three people that are probably interacting at the game in this story would be Casey, the catcher, and the umpire. And so I made the catcher Moses Fleetwood Walker, who was, because this was 1888, after he couldn't play Major League Baseball anymore, I had him sneaking in, pretending he was a Mexican player, couldn't speak. He pretended not to speak any English, and he was behind the plate as the catcher during this game. And so he fit in well into the story. And then I discovered that the winningest pitcher not in the Hall of Fame was a pitcher named Mouse Matthews. He was like 5'5". He won 297 career games or something, and he's not in the Hall of Fame. And I says, well, I need a pitcher, and here he is out of the same time period. I'm going to make my pitcher the winningest pitcher not in the Hall of Fame. And so I made him my pitcher. And then I needed a female character, and Nellie Bly was a famous journalist at the time. She actually got famous by infiltrating Blackwell's insane asylum in New York. She, I think she was only 19 at the time. She like pretended she was crazy, and they put her in this insane asylum. And then she wrote first an article for the New York World, and then a book about it called 10 Days in a Madhouse. And so she got famous for that. It kind of like changed insane asylums all over the country because she reported on the conditions.
Wow, that's incredible.
Yeah, and then she was also the first person to go around the world in 80 days. Jules Verne came out with a book, a novel, Around the World in 80 Days, at a time when it wasn't possible to get around the world in 80 days. But by this time, the railroads were up and running, and they figured out that maybe it was possible to go around the world in 80 days. And so she was actually, as a newspaper ploy, that this was the days of yellow journalism, when they were doing all kinds of crazy things to drive circulation, because newspapers were the only thing. There was no radio or television. And so like a city like New York would have 100 newspapers, and they were all competing for eyeballs. And so this was kind of a ploy to increase circulation. So they sent Nellie Bly around the world in 80 days. So that's actually in the novel as well. That happens in the novel as well. So there's these real life characters that I just found were like interesting, that were all in the same time period as the poem was written. And so I was able to work them all in a fictional way into the novel.
And it's pretty cool. So I actually recently wrote a book myself, more in the nonfiction realm, Winning in Sports Business. It's only $1 on Amazon, everybody. So go out and get it. If you need the $1, ask me. I'll give you the $1. You can have the book and the penny. I don't really care. I'm not getting rich off this book. But what was really interesting was, in the beginning of the course that I went through, all the fiction and nonfiction writers were together. And then eventually at some point we were kind of separated into our two groups. But the reason we were all together in the beginning was because it turns out when you're doing character research for these books, the easiest way to understand and build these characters is to do research on people and to interview people that you kind of want to pull character traits from. So how did it make it more difficult, or was it kind of not, like, rather than having that blank canvas, you at least had people to work with a little bit. Now you can kind of mold them and form them. This is 140 years ago, so I'm sure you had some creative liberties, but how much easier did it make it, or harder did it make it, to have specific people in mind with the understanding that, hey, these people did real things. We're just going to try to case it on the based as, right? You always see in the movies based on. How was that aspect of it? And again, how much easier or more difficult did that make it?
Yeah, I think it made it easier because, you know, I read all the autobiographies I could find on Cap Anson and Fleetwood Walker. And I mean, there's not a lot about them, but there's biographies written, so you can kind of find out what their background was. Essentially, like Moses Fleetwood Walker was college educated. Both him and his wife were college educated. He grew up in a town that was like before the Civil War, but he was just across the river of where the slaves were, and his father was like the first doctor in Ohio, and his mother was a midwife. So he was actually a well-educated. So, you know, so I could use that in the book. You know, here's an African American playing baseball in 1888, but he wasn't a dumb African American. He was a highly intelligent, college educated African American. So I could use that. And the same thing with the other characters. You know, I kind of got into Nellie Bly's personality, and, you know, of course I took liberties with it, but I think it made it easier because I could read about their personalities, and if it worked, it didn't. You know, one problem was my umpire is not a real life character. I had to invent him completely. I didn't use anybody. And when I finished the first draft of the book, I read it, and he was my narrator. And I thought, well, he's the most boring person in this book. You know, I've got to do something about that, because you know, I read that if you write a first draft of a novel and your narrator isn't the most interesting character, you probably ought to narrate it from the perspective of the character who is the most interesting. And I wanted to keep it the umpire. So when I wrote my second draft, I put him on the spectrum, which nobody, even in 1888, nobody knew what the spectrum was. Mm-hmm. But a modern day reader can like read about his habits and what he does and conclude pretty quickly that this guy was on the spectrum, which made him actually a better umpire, because people that are on the spectrum are completely honest. They say exactly what they mean. And if you want somebody to umpire against, you know, Casey, where everybody's booing you, you want an umpire who has to tell the truth about what he's calling balls and strikes, and has to focus. People on the spectrum, I mean, they're really good at, you know, I read books on people on the spectrum as well, and they're really good at focusing on one thing. And so it actually made him a more believable umpire being on the spectrum.
Yeah, and as you said, those first two strikes were called strikes, right? Right. So that might, it's understandable. And did we go? Who's Casey again? Did we talk about who Casey was?
You know, there's an argument about whether, you know, he's a totally fictional character in the poem. A lot of people.
Who did you base him off of?
I didn't base him off of anybody. In fact, I took liberty. You know, the poem kind of makes him a hero type of person. I gave him like a really flawed person. I made him kind of a hero, you know, a problem with hero worship in the book, because everybody just thought Casey walked on water. But you know, if you get into his personality in the book, you find out that, like so many celebrities, you know, they have kind of a dark side. And that's kind of like why the book is called The Strikeout That Shamed America, because toward the end of the book, you know, there's no spoiler that Casey strikes out, but the book takes it like a long time after he strikes out. And the end of the book kind of describes why it shamed America. But no, I built it, you know, I took liberties, and I basically just modeled him after what I would imagine somebody who was like really famous, but kind of a jerk would be like, you know, somebody that everybody just loved and adored, but probably didn't deserve to be loved and adored. That's kind of how I based him off of. In real life, a lot of people think he was based off of King Kelly, who was a baseball player at that time.
That's really interesting. I mean, I think the concept is really cool. Again, I just went through this process. I started like almost a year ago to the day when I started the process to write my book. And the first one was awesome. I assume there's a second one somewhere in me, so I'm excited to write it. But, you know, I think it's incredible what you're doing, Del. I think it's so cool. So I guess the last question I have for you essentially is, what's the message that you're trying to get across? What is the point of this story, and how are you? I mean, obviously, there's a lot of different things that you're pulling on here, especially being back in the 1880s, as you said. Having an African American catcher in a time when we didn't have African American players in baseball anymore, and having an umpire potentially on the spectrum, and having this hero that is worshipped, but it turns out he's not really the best kind of guy. So, like, what is the ultimate message you're trying to send with this story? And this creation of the kind of this universe that you almost put together yourself?
Yeah, I think I think the kind of the overall theme of the book is heroism, and where heroism actually comes from. I mean, Casey, everybody kind of worshipped him as a hero, but it was actually more Nellie Bly and the umpire and all these side characters that in a way were actually heroes themselves, but weren't kind of like held up as heroes. And I think the book kind of looks at basically hero worship. What is that? And who the real heroes are in a story.
I love it. And where can everyone find this book of yours? Let me one more time. At the Bat, The Strikeout That Shamed America. Where can we find it?
Yeah, it's on Barnes & Noble and Amazon. One easy way to find it is if you go on the Amazon website itself and search for Strikeout. For some reason, it comes up as the first or second hit.
That's pretty solid.
Yeah, it makes it a lot easier to find because the title's kind of long. So just go on the Amazon page itself, search Strikeout, and it'll be like every time I've done it, it's like at least in the top 3 hits.
Perfect. Well, I'm going to put the link in the show notes for everybody to Amazon, so you can go check that out. I'm very excited to check it out as well. Leonard Jones, author of At the Bat, The Strikeout That Shamed America, also worked at USA Today for a little while. Really appreciate your time today, man. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Enjoyed it.
Oh, where can everyone find you online? I forgot about that.
Mainly on LinkedIn is where I deal with most of my professional contacts. You can find me on LinkedIn.
Love it. Well, everybody hopefully enjoyed this while they were watching on LinkedIn, so that worked out for the two of us. So thank you very much, Del, and have a great day, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael.